Yeah, 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 yeah. Are we good? We're live? La la la, yeah, 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 yeah.
On the Facebook page, there's a go live. You clicked the go live on the Facebook page? No, he didn't.
Sure I did.
No,
says-
no, on the Facebook page. So go back to the Facebook page.
I believe we're live.
Oh, you are?
We are live.
You're live on Facebook, okay.
We are live on Facebook. In fact, there are 6 people who have joined us on Facebook already. It's very exciting. The technology is finally working. Hey everybody, thanks for joining us. Are you subscribed to my YouTube channel? Please do. And make sure you enable notifications. David, your mic is all funny here. It's wonky. I don't know. Yeah, we're live. Isaac Chaki Abasera, you the man. Yes, we're live. This is excellent. Baruch Hashem. Good. Okay, ready to rock and roll. Welcome, my friends, to Tom's Talmud Tisch. Today's episode, entitled Endangered Species, has been sponsored by Ian and Sarah Magid to commemorate the yahrzeit of Sarah's father, Shimon ben Yechiel. May his neshama have an aliyah, and may the merit of the Torah we study today from all over the world serve as a source of solace and comfort, uplifting that holy neshama in Gan Eden as he looks down at his family and prays for them. Okay, so today, my dear friends, we are going to study a fascinating piece of Gemara. And like many, many such details or narratives in the Gemara, on the surface, it's going to seem very strange. In fact, I'll make an admission. When I first started to learn this Gemara, it didn't make any sense to me. I mean, it really didn't. When the Gemara is going to tell me about things that endanger life, things that might shorten my life, I was surprised that this was the litany, the list of things the Gemara came up with. These seem like things that are not so onerous. On the Richter scale of sin, the 3 things we're going to mention do not register in a very intense way. If you're just joining us, you need to stay, because this is phenomenal. It's phenomenal because once we crack the code and figure out what the Gemara is talking about, you will find remarkable lessons for life. With no further ado, we're on Daf Nun Hey, page 55 in the Gemara in Masechet Berachot. It's the 9th chapter, the final chapter of this extraordinary first tractate of the Talmud. We have moved now from nurturing an attitude of gratitude to learning to appreciate life and its nuances, and what can, or perhaps cannot, contribute to longevity. In our previous few episodes, we talked about things which enable longevity. Today, the Gemara shares with us a list of 3 things that could cause the shortening of one's terrestrial life. This is, I believe, the 12th episode in our learning of this chapter of Gemara. And although we began with talking about the blessings we should be reciting over various experiences, we ended up focusing on the teaching of Rabbi Yehuda. And as the Gemara is wont to do, once we start with Rabbi Yehuda, we oftentimes include a variety of teachings which are somehow loosely related. And so the Gemara now presents yet another shmua, yet another teaching attributed to Rav Yehuda. V'amar Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda said, Shleisha dvarim mikatzrim yomov u'shnoisav shel adam. There are three things that can shorten one's days and years. And with regard to the notion of days and years, I refer you to a previous class, previous episode in which we talked about the notion of days and years and what the Gemara might be alluding to. Because after all, if you're going to have shortened days, obviously you'll have shortened years. So I'm not going to repeat that teaching. That was 2 classes ago. In summation, this is something that could cause the opposite of longevity. This can shorten your life. The Gemara is not going to be giving us, it seems, advice in the flesh. Instead, it seems that the Gemara is going to be talking about spiritual pursuit. Like ritual things. And that's what's going to be so strange, because of all the sins that a person could do, of all the inappropriateness, of all the iniquity, if you will. These are the 3 things that shorten life? Like, really? Number 1, a person who is given a Sefer Torah to read, which the notion of likris bei Sefer Torah seems to refer to the concept of being called to the Torah for what we call in today's language an aliyah. You might know that in antiquity, when somebody would be called to the Torah, they wouldn't simply recite a blessing. They would read the portion of the Torah that they were called to. In antiquity, every child went to cheder at a very young age. And for 5 years, they did nothing but master the 5 books of Chumash, the Pentateuch. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And mastering it meant first and foremost the text. They could read the text perfectly with all of its nuance, pronunciation, and chant sing-song. So if you got an aliyah, perfect. You could just hold up and you could start reading. So what happened? Well, what happened is that as life got more difficult, not everybody was going to cheder. Not everybody was getting an education. And because when you get called to the Torah, you're expected to read from the Torah, what happened is people stopped coming to shul for fear of being called to the Torah. Now, I know there's something called stage fright, or at least I used to know what that is. I was very shy as a kid, I was actually terrified, even to lead the services when I was a little boy. Nobody believes me today, but it's true. I really was terrified. I haven't had that for a long, long time. But people have a fear of crowds and a fear of public speaking. I once heard that there are people who are more afraid of speaking in public than dying, which made me think that at every funeral I officiate, there are more people who would rather be in the box than at the podium where I'm standing, which does not make any sense to me. So I'm not sure if that's accurate. But people are afraid of getting up in public. Maybe they're afraid of making a fool of themselves, afraid of their self-conscience. But it doesn't seem from the writings of our sages that was the issue. It doesn't seem. It seems the issue was they didn't know how to read. So they stopped coming. So our rabbis, who are very wise and compassionate, who are also concerned with communal involvement in Yiddishkeit, made an injunction. An injunction that when you got an aliyah, you would no longer read. There would be somebody appointed as the reader, and you would merely recite the blessings before and after. There was a fellow who used to come to shul here many years ago, and he had this, we'll call it shtick. He had this thing that since he knew most of the Torah, whenever he would get called, he would want to read that portion himself. And I asked him, please not to. And he got very offended. He said, why? I said, because first of all, it's showing off. We're going to learn a little bit later that showing off is not a good thing to do. You make other people look bad. And it's not appropriate. The Rebbe himself, when he was called for an aliyah, and he was called for an aliyah every time a Torah was read, did not read from the Torah. The Baal Korah, the one who is appointed to read from the Torah, reads on your behalf. There's a similar notion, which is also linked to the concept of bikurim, the firstling fruit that was brought in the Beit HaMikdash annually. It required a showing up. You had to actually come yourself. You had to bring firstling fruit, and there was a sophisticated system of how you would identify those fruits and how you would cure that which wouldn't remain fresh for long enough. And then, in addition to the pomp and circumstance of presenting these fruits and of coming together with all of your fellow members of Am Yisrael to the Beis HaMikdash, there was a reading. It was a reading. Higadti Hayoim, as the Torah details it in Parshat Ki Tavo. And you're supposed to say something. Not your own words. You have lines, you read your lines from the Torah. You know, there was a time towards the end of the second Beit HaMikdash that the rabbis, the leadership, noticed that people were not coming, at least not as copiously as before. The numbers were down. So if numbers were down, they had to ask a question, why? What are we doing wrong? If there's a lack of religious fervor, a lack of zeal and enthusiasm for Yiddishkeit, then we have to know what that is, and we have to find a way to fix it. And so they investigated, and they could detect no dampening of enthusiasm. People were still as excited as they were, at least those who were coming. Why weren't they bringing the firstling fruit? So eventually they found out that the reason that people were coming at a diminishing rate was because people were afraid and ashamed to get up there and break their teeth on the Hebrew. They were conversant in Aramaic, but did not speak Hebrew well. Most spoke Greek well, not Hebrew. They couldn't read. They didn't know it by heart. So our sages instituted the notion of an official reader. You'd come, and he'd read on your behalf, for everybody, even for the greatest scholars. Clearly, removing shame, removing discomfort, giving people a sense of dignity is an extremely important part of our Yiddishkeit. The notion of keeping the masses in the dark, the notion of keeping them ignorant, the notion of keeping them afraid, all of which has been found in various faith systems, has nothing to do with Torah Judaism. In your Torah Judaism habitat, your rabbi wants you to learn. He wants you to know. He shares Torah whenever he can. And if you're not comfortable, that's a problem. That's a problem for us. We have to find ways to make you comfortable in shul. And I'm saying this all as a preamble to the notion of mishenoston lesefer Torah likros ve'enikora. A person is called up as for an aliyah, and he doesn't want to go. According to Rav Yehuda, it could be mekatzer shnotav shel adam. It could actually shorten a person's life. Now, in view of Rabbi Yehuda's teaching, you understand why it was so important to have a Baal Korah. Because if you're not going to have a Baal Korah and people are going to avoid getting called up to the Torah or even leave when they're called, refusing an aliyah, what this brings about is a shortening of life, chas v'shalom. That's not a simple matter. Now, I know some of you are probably scratching your heads. What? That's going to shorten your life? You mean not pork, not into marriage? No. Those are fine. That's not going to shorten your life. Violating Shabbat? It doesn't say that. Not putting on tefillin? Doesn't say that. Not having a mezuzah? Doesn't say that. Getting called to the Torah for an aliyah. Which mitzvah of the 613th mitzvah is the mitzvah of getting called to the Torah? I can tell you with absolute comfort, none of them. There is no mitzvah to get an aliyah. So, of all things, this was the sin Rabbi Yehuda chose to tell us that there would be a consequence of a swift death. Obviously, that makes no sense. So this is one of those portions of the Gemara that clearly requires investigation. We need to look more deeply into the statement of Rabbi Yehuda to understand and appreciate what he's really saying. And I want you to know that when we will crack the code and figure this out, you will find a lesson for life that applies not only to getting an aliyah, but you got to stay with me. So that's the first statement. First, I gave you the background. I told you why somebody might not want to have an aliyah, and yet, nonetheless, the Gemara says that despite the fact that this is the case, it could shorten your life. Not a good situation. The second, also similar. Somebody who is given kos shel bracha levracha, levarech, he's handed the proverbial cup of blessing to lead Berachat HaMazon, the grace after meals, ve'eino mevarech, but he refuses the honor and doesn't lead the proverbial benching. And once again, your head's exploding. So somebody was asked to lead the benching, and they're ashamed to lead the benching. For this, you have a life that's shortened. I mean, seriously, on the Richter scale of sins, that doesn't even register. Why would Rabbi Yehuda say that? I'll tell you a little secret. When I was a bar mitzvah boy, I was terrified even to lead the benching. Even my wife doesn't believe me. I was terrified. I just hoped my father would never hand a cup to me because I was just really afraid, tongue-tied. I had so much stage fright as a kid. So somebody has stage fright, and they hand him a glass and say, you lead the benching. No, I don't want to lead the benching. Shorten his life? You gotta be kidding. What in heaven is Rav Yehuda talking about? I'm glad you asked, because we're going to get to the bottom of this. But definitely on the surface, it does not seem to make sense. And the third thing, this is even worse. V'hamaneg atzmei b'rabonus. A person who behaves in a manner of, well, Rabbi Evan Yisrael translates it as superiority, but that's not really what it means, with all due respect. A Rav is a spiritual leader or a master. So one who acts as if he is a master. Maybe that's what superiority means, like a smug superiority complex. But quite literally, it means a person who acts with authority, presidentially, a person who asserts themselves, a leader. You want to be a leader? Expect a shortened life. Now, I know that leadership can have a good deal of angst and heartache and frustration. And yes, a great deal of grief and stress. But there are a lot of things that give you stress. You know those air controllers? I think they retire them when they're about like 50 or something. They say it's one of the shortest careers out there because the stress of sitting in that control tower and making sure that those little blips don't collide, knowing that each blip represents several hundred lives, and if you doze off or daydream, you could become a mass murderer, is so much stress, it's so much pressure that it like literally discombobulates people. They can't function at a certain point. So you're going to tell me that being a rabbi is more stressful than being an air controller? I mean, the Gemara could just say, stress is a bad thing for you. Stress is going to kill you. Don't stress. Why does Rav Yehuda say one who behaves in a manner of Rabbanos, besides the fact that the Gemara in Masechet Ksubot on page 103 says specifically that a person who's appointed to a leadership position must assert themselves and must behave presidentially and authoritatively. In fact, elsewhere the Talmud says that a person who has a position of leadership and authority, who doesn't behave in a manner in accordance with the dignity of the office, is considered to be a sinner. When you're appointed to a certain position, certain limitations come along with it, especially if it's a position of importance in the milieu of Torah and of Yiddishkeit, because it's not you, it's the Torah you represent. It's even God you represent. So, why does Yehuda say, Hamanig atzmei b'rabbanos, that somebody who behaves with this kind of authoritative superiority is going to find his life shortened? Okay, we've discovered the endangered species. These are the three people whose lives are endangered. What in heaven is going on here? So let's take a look at, let's stick with the Gemara, the continuation of the Gemara. The Gemara says, Sefer Torah Likros. Let's start with the notion of a person who's called to the Torah and he doesn't want to go. He doesn't want to go because he is uncomfortable. Maybe even after the rabbis instituted that you don't have to read from the Torah, now the person is terrified to recite the blessings in public. In fact, I know firsthand of people who refuse an aliyah, who say to me, please don't call me up. And I'm like, why? They're like, I'm not comfortable reciting the blessing. I've seen young men being called up before the wedding, shaking like a leaf. And I'm like, hey, chill, man. It's just an aliyah. You don't have to read it. And it doesn't help. So, if somebody doesn't want to get called up and do something in a public way, it does not seem fair to suggest that that would cause a shortening of their days or years. In fact, one could argue that having the stress of being called up would in fact be unhealthy. Rabbi Yehuda qualifies his words by telling us that it's a statement in the Torah. Oh, statement in the Torah. Deuteronomy 30, in the 20th verse says, Midichsiv, because it is written, Ki hu chayecha v'orech yomecha. Because it meaning the Torah, is your life and the length of your days. So Rav Yehuda reasoned, if the Torah is your life and length of your days, and you're called up to the Torah and you refuse that, you're essentially refusing that which is your life and length of days. Hence, your life and days could be shortened. Okay, so how do we understand this? What does that really mean? The first thing that I want to make very clear to you is that we're not talking about a punishment. The punishments or consequences for sin are spelled out in the Torah. And Rav Yehuda was not wont to plagiarizing the Torah. And he's going to come along and say, you know, this and this sin could shorten your life, as in you'll die prematurely. The Torah does list a number of different sins and says, v'nichraso hanefesh, which literally means the soul will be cut off. And it has multiple meanings, the simplest of which is that a person would not live out their years. There's something called kares, in something called mitabi de shamayim, this being cut off or excision, this heavenly imposed death sentence, and it typically refers to a person passing at a very young age, before the age of 50 or before the age of 60. And that's why your 50th birthday is considered to be a day of meaning, a day of meaning where you leave behind the notion of misa b'dei shamayim, and kares is left behind when you reach the age of 60. And the Gemara actually talks about Rav Yosef, who was Ovid Yom Tova, who made a whole holiday, a festival for the sages to rejoice with him because he had left the notion of karet behind. In fact, the first time that the Rebbe publicly farbrengt on his Yom Huledet, on his birthday, the wonderful day of Yud Aleph Nisan, was in 1962, when the Rebbe turned 60. So he did say a mimer on his 50th birthday, which happened to be on a Shabbat, and it was in his office, a very private affair. About 10 or 15 students came into the Rebbe's study on Shabbos morning, and the Rebbe delivered a Hasidic discourse beginning with the words, Hashem sefasai tiftach ufi agiti l'secha. That was on his 50th birthday, but that was in a very understated way. It was 2 years after he had become Rebbe. But in his 60th birthday, the Rebbe did farbrengt. In fact, my father told me that when he was a little boy, in 1962, and he wasn't that little, he was yeshiva bach already. He was 16, I think, or 17. So his Rosh Hashiva that year was Rabbi Bucket. And Rabbi Bucket called him over and he said to them, he showed them this Gemara with Rav Yosef. And he says, you're going to see. There's going to be a farbrengen tonight. And they're like, Rabbi Bucket, how do you know that? And he said, you'll see. You're going to see. Look what the Gemara says. You'll see. And he was right. There was a farbrengen, you know. Anyway, so there are things in the Torah for which we are told life will be cut short. This is not one of those things. Rav Yosef Rav Yehuda, did not come to add to the Torah. The Torah says that such and such sins will shorten your life. And Rav Yehuda says, add another few. Besides which, he's not talking about sins. Nowhere in the Torah does it say, thou shalt not refuse an aliyah, and nowhere does it say, thou shalt not refuse the opportunity to lead the grace after meals, and nowhere in the Torah does it say, thou shalt not act presidentially if you are, in fact, in a leadership position. It doesn't say that anywhere. But that's not the verse Rabbi Yehuda just quoted. The verse he quoted was a positive verse. A verse that describes the virtues of Torah, namely, Ki hu chayecha v'orech yomecha, because it is your life. It is the material of which life is woven. It is the length or quality of your days. So how then are we to understand this? There is a very, very interesting notion. Very interesting notion that leaving behind a positive potential or possibility, leaving an opportunity on the table, is essentially as bad as losing something. I think Benjamin Franklin plagiarized this from somewhere when he said that a penny earned, a penny not earned is a penny lost, or something like that. I think in Franklin's Almanac that was one of the adages that showed up there. A penny not earned is a penny lost. In other words, we should not only look at the sum of life as it exists for us, we should look at life as it could be, as it would be, maybe even as it should be. This is not a very profound thing necessarily. People will often lament the loss of potential, loss of possibility. From the fact that Rav Yehuda does not quote a verse that says that not doing such and such will necessarily diminish, but rather quoting a positive verse, it's very obvious Rav Yehuda is talking about the positive possibility. It's very clear. So, what are we talking about? Here's what I would like to suggest. Dvarim Aleph. David, can you help me? Dvarim Aleph. Yeah, one of those. Perfect. So I remembered when I was trying to understand this Gemara, and I was really having a hard time, I remembered coming across one of the early morning lessons. And I was teaching this book, Biurei HaChumash, which is a synopsis of the Rebbe's talks. And I looked for it, and I found it. And here is the gist of the teaching that stuck in my head, or kind of came to me as I was trying to figure this Gemara out. The Alter Rebbe, in Hilchos Talmud Torah, the second chapter, Perek Beis, Siman Daled, subsection 4, states the following, in halachic prose. This idea is found in the Poskim earlier, and it's ultimately from a verse in the Torah, from the sages, and ultimately hills back to a verse. But I'm presenting it in the very, very neat and precise prose, halachic prose of the Alter Rebbe. Quote, Kol hashocheach davar echad mimishnato, anybody who is to forget something of that which he learned, machmas shalechozer alimudai, because he didn't repeat what was learned, meaning he learned the lesson once and didn't repeat it. I was speaking to somebody this morning. I said, so are you going to join me to learn Gemara today? I said, I'm going to be live. He says, nah. I said, why not? He says, I learned Gemara Brachos 8 years ago. I thought to myself, you don't even remember the subject matter we're going to talk about today. I said, you remember what we learned? So I remember some of it. I'm like, don't you know you have to review? I hope he's watching. Because the Alter Rebbe says, this is basically a Mishnah. The Mishnah says that somebody who forgets his learning forfeits his life. But the Alter Rebbe is explaining this Mishnah. He says, forgetting something of your learning is not a punishment for somebody who forgets. That's natural. Human beings are forgetful by design. Very few of us, if any, have perfect memories. We all forget things. The point is, you don't plan to fail, you fail to plan. You didn't plan to forget it. You didn't review. So invariably, you were going to forget. That is to say, from a Torah perspective, knowledge is something that is meant to be retained. It's meant to be retained. So it's not only about learning new things, which is very important. One wise person once said, the day you stop learning is the day you stop living. And you can learn from everybody and every situation. As per the words of King Solomon, Mikol melamdei skalti. I've learned from everybody. I try to learn new things every day. I can't believe how dumb I was yesterday so often. But it's not enough only to learn new things. We need to constantly review the things we've learned so that we don't lose the knowledge acquired. It's really, really important from a Torah perspective to keep learning new things. It's even more important to retain that which you had. If you learned it, learn it again. A little fringe benefit is that the more you learn a Torah text, the better you understand it. And it always has novelty. It always rings in a dynamic fashion. It amazes me how year after year after year, I study Chitas, I'm learning the daily Chumash, I'm learning the daily Tanya, and I'm understanding it differently. I'm like, where have I been? Why didn't I ever know this? But this is the nature of Torah study, because Torah is Rachava Miniyam. Torah is broader than the widest and deepest sea. It's godly, and it's endless. So the Alter Rebbe says, if you forget something that you learned, machmas shalei chazer, because you didn't review, koroi, properly, very important little word, properly, appropriately, as per your station in life and your wherewithal, meaning as you're able. You are able. Maila lavakosov, the scripture considers it, ki'ilu mischayev benafshei, as if you were to be guilty of forfeiting your life. V'gam oiver belav shel Torah, you also violate explicit instructions of the Torah. The Torah says, rak yishomer lecha, but watch yourself. Ushmor nafshcha, guard your life, me'oid, exceedingly. Pen tishkach es hadvarim asher ro einecha, lest you forget the things your eyes saw. This is from the 4th chapter of Deuteronomy. It's the 9th verse. It's when Moshe Rabbeinu is talking about, don't forget the events at Har Sinai, at Mount Sinai. These were people who were actually present. They were children or teenagers. They were present. The women were older also. Only the men died in the desert. And he said, don't forget what you saw. You need to remember this. And the Talmud understands this verse as not only specific to the events of Mount Sinai, but in fact to all of Torah, which is ultimately derived from that moment of revelation and from that event called Matan Torah at Har Sinai. So the Rebbe asked 2 questions. The first question he asks is, it seems that the prohibition here, if you will, is the obligation to review. You have to review properly. Well, if you have to review properly, then why wouldn't the Torah just say you need to review properly? In other words, if this is an imperative, something you're supposed to do, why would the Torah come along and say, Raki shomer lecha shmor nafshecha, guard yourself and guard your life, pen tishkach, lest you forget? From which we understand that lest you forget is not to be understood as the natural forgetfulness that every person struggles with, but rather the steps one must take to safeguard the memory and to keep the notion of that which you had alive and fresh. You know, they say, use it or lose it about language. So use it. You learned an idea of Torah. Speak about it. Think about it. Review it. Teach it. And then hopefully you remember it. And you have to continue reviewing. So why does it say pen tishkach, lest you forget? Just say. Moshe Rabbeinu should say, hey, talk about this. Remind yourself of it. Keep reviewing it. That's number 1. And question number 2 is, okay, I understand. One is supposed to review. I get that. But even if one is supposed to review, is it fair that the consequence should be fatal if you didn't? I can think of bigger sins. And so can you. Homicide, incest, for starters. I think that would be a lot worse than somebody who didn't review. How about the person who never even studied Torah? Oh, he's fine. He's got nothing to forget. He only enjoys life and has fun. You went to a Torah class, you're in trouble. You went to a Torah class, you listened, you learned, you forgot, dead. Seriously? Doesn't seem a little over the top. It's almost making the case for everybody to stay away and not learn anything, because it's worse to learn and forget than not to learn at all. So the Rebbe says something is missing. You can't just read this in its literal iteration. There are those, the Rebbe says, there are those commentaries who explain that the notion of forgetfulness is bad because it will lead to non-observance. Because you don't know what to do, because you forgot what to do, because you learned what to do and now you don't remember anymore. But that doesn't seem to jibe with the words of Alter Rebbe, who says, Kol ha-shocheach, not because forgetfulness is a step towards non-observance, but because forgetfulness in and of itself seems to be the problem. So the Rebbe says that the idea that has to be understood, has to be framed with regard to Torah is based on this notion of Kihem Chayenu ve'erech Yameinu. Very interestingly, the Rebbe sources the Gemara in this Masechet in a few pages now, on page 61. It doesn't source this Gemara, I don't know why. But exactly what Rav Yehuda is saying here. Kihem Chayenu ve'erech Yameinu. And the Rebbe says because Torah is a source of life, one who forgets or empties themselves of that which is a life elixir, life-giving, it's as if you lost a piece of life. One who forgets something that he or she learned, the Torah considers it kilu mischayev ben nafshei. It's not a punishment, says the Rebbe. Chas v'shalom, heaven forfend. God doesn't punish for forgetting Torah. It's that you had something which could necessarily have given you life and you lost it. You lost it because you didn't bother watching it. You had something which could have shielded you. You had something which could have given you that longevity, but you lost it. So it's ke'ilu mischayev b'nafshei. It's that now, if you won't have that longevity because you lost it, who is responsible? Your negligence in holding on to that which would have allowed you to live another day, but you won't live another day because you dropped it. Who's responsible for the loss of that day? Had you never learned, you never would have had that day. Now you had the day, or hour, or moment, or year. And you lost it because you lost it, because you were negligent. So it's ke'ilu mischayev. It's not as a consequence or as a punishment. It's the Torah we studied necessarily gave us longevity, and we left the longevity behind. And the Rebbe says that's why it's about reviewing, because it's not the punishment of forgetting. The point is, once you got it, use it so you don't lose it. Because as long as you use it, as long as you possess it, as long as you have it, you'll have the blessings that come in its tow. Okay, so that's very nice. That works for understanding Torah. How does that work for our Gemara? All right, you can start to use your imagination a little, but you don't even have to. You don't even have to, because I ended up finding another Sikha, an edited talk of the Rebbe. This is found in Likutei Sichos in the 29th volume. It's a Sikha on Parshas Vayelech. It talks about the last hours of Moshe's life, where it says, Nistumu menu ma'yonas ha'chochma, that the sources, the wellspring of intuition that Moshe Rabbeinu was blessed with, which are beyond imagination, suddenly sealed. He didn't have the same level of intuition anymore. And it's a very beautiful rumination that the Rebbe develops. And then it ends like this. The Rebbe quotes this statement from our sages, which is found in Pirkei Avot, in the Mishnah, in Perek Gimel, in the 8th Mishnah, and brought lahalacha in the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, which I just read to you, Hilchos Talmud Torah. So in this Sikha, the Rebbe asks the same kind of question. He says, such a punishment doesn't seem a little excessive? And the Rebbe says one of the ways to understand this is, and he uses some very interesting language here. He says, when a Yid learns Torah, the words of Torah become engraved on your being. Perhaps metaphorically speaking, or maybe not. I once read somewhere that when you acquire information, that there are little wrinkles in the brain, and that the brain stores information like little chips. We don't really know how the brain works, but somehow it seems that the more one uses the brain, the more these tiny little, almost microscopic wrinkles develop. And every time you know something, you actually retain it. There's like a physical impact on the actual brain. I don't know if that's what the Rebbe means, but maybe it's just a metaphor. But the words of the Rebbe are, the words of Torah are nechkak. They are engraved in your etzem mitziut, in your very being. So much so that every word of Torah, this is heavy, every word of Torah becomes a part of your very being. So you are born, whoever you are, and then you develop. You and I, whoever we are, is a sum total of our experiences, of the knowledge we acquired, the things we learned from mistakes and the things we learned from toil and diligence. We are all complicated creatures. We react certain ways because things might have happened in our childhood. A cornerstone of Freudian psychology, of how we can sometimes heal people's phobias by going back to find out what triggered the phobia to begin with. And I'm only using that as an example. We are necessarily a conglomeration of the experiences we had in life. It's not only things we know, it's who we become. The people we met, the things we heard, the things we saw, the things we understood, the way we understood them. That becomes the backdrop for the next piece of information. So when a piece of information comes your way, you analyze that piece of information based on your other experiences. If you weren't experienced, you say, yeah, that looks great. If you had experience, you say, I'm circumspect. I'm not so sure that's a good idea. And this really can divide into tiny little nanoseconds of reality. Every little moment is yet another experience. My father once told me something very clever. I don't know if he heard it from somebody or thought of this himself. He said that people who live, make it through extreme pressure, have precious experience. And he says that like the metaphor of a diamond, which is caused through extreme pressure, in which the coal or the carbon eventually becomes a diamond. He says when you have these experiences, eventually it steels you, it hardens you, it softens you, it shapes you as a result of experiences that we have, and not giving up, but seeing things through to their end and being able to absorb the various challenges, we actually can emerge as a diamond. People have sensitivities that they developed based on experiences they had. Sometimes even a very painful experience can make you a much better person, can make you a more thoughtful person, can make you a more humble person, can make you a more sensitive person, a wiser person, a more discerning individual. It can grant you intuition. Rarely have great heroes been born with silver spoons in their mouths. Most of the people who achieved greatness had to push back against enormous challenges. And that developed them. It made them into better people. So this is almost, I'm saying this parabolically. Bottom line, the Rebbe says here that every time we study a little bit of Torah, it makes up who we are. As Torah Jews, we are a composite of the Torah we studied and experienced, of the Torah we understood. So what happens if you forget something that you knew? A part of Torah that contributed to the richness of your life, either quantitatively or qualitatively, and then you lost that lesson. What happens? What happens is you lost something. If you were wiser because of something you learned or knew, and then you don't know it anymore, who lost? You did. Somebody said something very wise to me recently. He said, people want to forget the past year, awful year, oh, what a go for a new year. If you forget what happened last year and you don't learn its lessons, then you're poorer for it. If for whatever reason those are the experiences you had to go through, now take those experiences and carry them with you. Not in a way of misery or anger or angst, but in a positive way of learning the lessons from it. This is very real. Now multiply this. When you talk about Torah, which is not just about experience, not just about wisdom, not just about know-how, but Torah is actually a source of life. And the Rebbe says, if it's true about Torah, it's true about time. Jede Rege von sein Leben. Every moment of life, the Rebbe says, darf sein verbunden mit Torah, has to be linked to Torah. Torah study is not something we do as a hobby, a passion, or a vocation. Torah study is who we are supposed to be. That's the meaning of Ki heim chayenu, for it is life itself. It's life itself. Yes, we may have a class that begins at a certain time or ends at a certain time, but Torah study is life itself. Because it's life itself. When a Yid is chas v'sholem mevatel Torah, when he loses the opportunity for Torah, we have this very onerous Gemara, Masechet Sanhedrin, on page 99, that says, Hikaris Tikaris. That's the verse that says you should be cut off. Cut off because I wasted a moment of Torah. You lost the potential of life. Ad kan divri harav. This is what I was able to glean from the words of the Rebbe. And going back to our Gemara, which the Rebbe did not talk about. This is how I understand the words of Rav Yehuda. This is how I understand it. I may be wrong, but this is how I understand it. It's the only way I can understand it, in fact. Getting an aliyah is a privilege. Being called up to the Torah brings you a certain enrichment. You know that there's a minhag Yisrael, a custom, that before we have the observance of a yahrzeit, of a parent, for example, and we always remain tethered to our parents. And a yahrzeit, the anniversary of the passing, is a day in which the soul is elevated to the next realm. The neshama grows constantly. Righteous souls continue to live and grow. Tzadikim yelchu mechayil el choyel. The righteous go from strength to strength. V'amech kulam tzadikim. We're all called on some level righteous. But this notion of being able to grow constantly is kind of measured. And every year on the yahrzeit, there's a huge surge forward. It's like you graduate to the next class. And because there's an aliyah, we do things to help the neshama along. That's why Kaddish is recited. That's why Mishnayot is learned. That's why we have a custom of getting people together and saying L'chaim, inspiring each other with stories of the one who passed. And there's a minhag that the progeny gets an aliyah. The son gets an aliyah. Or Hasidim of a Rebbe will get an aliyah on the Shabbat prior, because Shabbat is the source of blessing for the events of that week. And because the blessing comes through the Holy Shabbat, getting an aliyah on Shabbat means you are elevated so that when the elevation takes place for this neshama that you share a kindred bond with, you too will have been empowered to be elevated. It's our custom that on the Shabbat prior to one's birthday, one should also endeavor to get an aliyah, because a birthday means you're graduating to the next year of life. And it's like a circular thing, but more like a spiral, because you're going around the annual cycle, but now you're going to the next level. Now you begin your next year. That's an aliyah. Getting bumped up, you get a bump up, you get an aliyah lifts you up. In other words, an aliyah, getting called to the Torah, is necessarily a life-elevating event. And as such, you can understand that it's also an opportunity for which you're able to derive or take life. As the study of Torah is the source of our lives, even getting called up to an aliyah becomes the source of life. I have a distinct memory as maybe a teenager in my early 20s. One of my campers celebrated his bar mitzvah, and he had an aliyah at the Rebbe's minyan, and I think later it was during the distribution of dollars in which the Rebbe would encourage people to become a shliach mitzvah, an agent to pass on kindness. Or maybe on another occasion, the Rebbe said to his father, "Today your son was called to the Torah. He was oila la Torah. He should be oila bit Torah. He should be elevated in Torah." So the Rebbe framed the getting called to the Torah as not only getting called to the Torah for an aliyah, but it's being called to become elevated in the Torah. I think what Rav Yehuda is trying to convey to us is not the notion of a punishment, chas v'shalom, but rather Rav Yehuda is coming to give us insight into the preciousness of an aliyah. The preciousness of an aliyah is such that when we receive an aliyah, we necessarily have the possibility of extending or enriching our lives. Refusing it then is shortening your life, meaning shortening the possibility to have attained that longevity or life elixir. So by extension, let's think about this. What really did Rav Yehuda teach us? It's not only a teaching about an aliyah. By extension, it's ultimately a teaching about opportunities, Yiddishkeit opportunities. Rav Yehuda's words, I'd like to humbly suggest, maybe I'm wrong, I don't think so. I think when Rav Yehuda says that Shleisha Dvarim Mekatzrim Yom V'Shneisa Shel Adam is not to be understood only in its most literal iteration. Mishenosnin lo Sefer Torah likros ve'eno kora. One who is given a Sefer Torah to read, and he doesn't read from it in a literal iteration, which it does mean literally getting called to an aliyah, which used to once upon a time mean reading for the Torah. It means if you're given the opportunity to grow in your Yiddishkeit, if you're given the opportunity to read from the Torah so that others will hear, so that others will be elevated, and you refuse the opportunity just because Mekatz and Shneisov. Like, why do you think you got that opportunity? Everything is by divine design. All of the potential that you or I have is a gift. We didn't pay for it. We didn't earn it. It was given to us. The question is, what will we do with that potential? We will never be held culpable for potential we didn't have. We will always be held responsible for potential that wasn't developed. How did the famous Hasidic sage Reb Meshulam Zusya of Anipoli say? He said, when I die, I'm not afraid of being asked, why weren't you Zalman or Levi? I'm afraid of being asked, why weren't you Zusya? Why weren't you who you could be? How did the Marines say? Be all you can be. Well, in the army of Hashem, my friends, it applies to us all. Be all you can be. Seize every opportunity. If you're given an opportunity to speak about Torah, don't decline. But I have stage fright. But I'd rather not. But what if people will say that I'm abusing my position? You have an opportunity to speak words of Torah, speak. Nostan le Sefer Torah. You're given a Sefer Torah likros. You're given an opportunity to read from the Torah, which I would like to believe means, by extension, utilizing every possibility to share words of Torah, to announce words of Torah, to teach words of Torah, to share words of Torah, to revel in words of Torah. If you're given the opportunity, seize it. Because refusal is tantamount to a shortening of your life. There are no accidents. You were given that opportunity. Like everything, by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, by Almighty God Himself. Don't leave Torah opportunities on the table. Anyway, that's my humble suggestion for the meaning of this first part of the teaching of Reb Yehuda. I thank you all for joining me today. I encourage you to watch this again if you missed some of it. I'm reminding you all to subscribe to youtube.com/Rabbi Mendel Kaplan and enable notifications. And let's continue to study Torah together, because as we study Hashem's Torah together, we are necessarily downloading not only knowledge, but life itself. And we should never refuse the opportunity to acquire life, never leave the opportunity to absorb the holiness, vivacity, and energy of Torah into our souls. Kiheim chayenu ve'oirech yameinu, because it is the very substance of which life itself is woven. And learning Torah brings us closer to Hashem and accelerates the day in which kulam yedu oisi, a time of eternal bliss, the coming of Mashiach, b'mheira u'biyamenu amen. Make sure you join me again next week, and we'll go on to Endangered Species Part 2 as we begin to analyze the notion of not reciting or leading the benching over a glass. Why such serious consequences? And hopefully we'll also talk about the notion of superiority and acting presidential when you're a leader. Stay tuned. I'll see you back. Thank you.